It's working.
Okay, great. All right, I'm waiting for 2:40 to get closer to the official start time, but I can get set up in a second. All right, so this is a project with collaborators from the University of Cyprus, Maria Plastira and Dr. Marius Abramidis, as well as Alinda Friedman from the University of Alberta. And in this project, we're examining how ethnic and social factors influence the geographic knowledge that Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots have of their country. Yep. Okay. So the spatial representations of geographical knowledge that we use to navigate, to come up with shortcuts, to make spatial judgments are imperfect. They're not metrically veridical. And there's plenty of evidence that we represent spatial locations such as world cities in terms of psychological regions based on spatial as well as non-spatial factors. So spatial factors can include the presence of physical boundaries, the location of geographic landmarks, such as the poles, and so on. Whereas non-spatial factors may include semantic factors, such as whether two cities belong to the same administrative or political region versus not, the salience and familiarity of locations, as well as socio-political factors. For example, Carbon and Letter showed that in contemporary reunified Germany, Germans were more likely to overestimate the distance of cities when those were across the former east-west border of Germany as opposed to within. So there was this border effect leading to the overestimation of distances. And this effect was stronger for those with more negative attitudes towards reunification. So this suggested that non-spatial factors, such as social attitudes, can moderate the effect of spatial factors like a physical boundary or a former physical boundary. So we wanted to extend the work of Carbon and Letter in this project by examining the influence of sociopolitical and physical or spatial factors in the unique geopolitical context of Cyprus, an island that is divided to this day since 1974 and has inhabitants on each side, the north and the south, who are of distinct ethnic communities. So we have Turkish Cypriots residing primarily in the north, Greek Cypriots residing primarily in the south, and moreover, these individuals have varying degrees of contact with the other community and the environment of the other community. So this affords an interesting opportunity to explore both the influence of spatial and non-spatial factors on geographic representation. So for a little bit more context, Cyprus is an island on the eastern basin of the Mediterranean with a long history of invaders and occupiers. The Turkish Cypriot community emerged out of the Ottoman rule in the 1800s, and the two communities, the Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities, experienced long periods of conflict, some periods of peace. Shortly after gaining independence from British colonial rule in 1960, there was intercommunal violence that erupted, particularly between 63 and 67, at which time thousands of Turkish Cypriots fled, facing violence by Greek Cypriot paramilitaries and formed enclaves that were majority Turkish Cypriot. Later on in 1974, there was a coup d'etat that was backed by the Greek government with the intent of unifying Cyprus with Greece, which led to the Turkish invasion or Turkish intervention, depending on perspective, and resulted in the division of the island as you see it here on this slide with this blue teal-colored line reflecting the UN buffer zone. At that time, Greek Cypriots who lived in the north moved in the south, and vice versa. Turkish Cypriots who lived in the south moved in the north. So we have refugees or internally displaced individuals from both sides. There had been virtually no contact between the two communities until 2003, when the UN buffer zone open specific checkpoints that allowed people from both communities to visit the other side. Okay, so in this context, we wanted to ask whether the physical divide, that is the UN buffer zone, influences spatial estimates. Would we replicate Carbon and Letter's results to find that Cypriots overestimate distances across the boundary, the UN buffer zone, versus within a given side? And our second question is, would we find that biases in spatial estimates depend on attitudes towards the other community? Again, could we replicate the finding that those with more negative attitudes commit more overestimation? We collected data from 571 participants from the two communities who identified as Greek or Turkish Cypriot. We have a good age range of adults up till their mid to late 80s. We've sampled participants from all or most districts in the north and the south, and we have comparable proportions of participants from each community, from the two communities that are refugees or internally displaced or have a parent who was a refugee or internally displaced. Okay, so in terms of the spatial tasks that we used, first we selected a subset of towns in Cyprus. We selected 17 towns based on a pilot study. We wanted those towns to be familiar to people of both communities, to have familiar locations and familiar names. And that was important because names changed historically over time, particularly after 1974. So after we've selected identified some cities that were familiar to both communities, participants did a series of 3 tasks, the first being a town knowledge task, in which participants rated their familiarity with each town. The name was presented and participants had to rate familiarity on a 0 to 9 scale, with 0 being absolutely no knowledge of the city to 9 being excellent knowledge. Then they did 2 spatial tasks in a counterbalance order, one being the distance estimation task. So the names of 2 cities were presented as text, and participants had to judge the distance between them, that being the aerial distance as the crow flies, were the instructions, the direct line in kilometers between those 2 towns. The other task was a location task. So the name of a given city was presented as text, and participants had to move their cursor, this was a computer-based task, to locate where the town was. We did not provide a map or an outline of Cyprus. Instead, we had a blank screen with 2 vertical lines indicating the eastern and western boundaries of the island. And after that, participants completed some questionnaires seeking information about demographic information, their age, gender, refugee status, political ideology, religion, and so on, as well as a number of questionnaires about their attitudes that I'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so now before we get to the results, a couple of more notes about the design of the distance estimation task to understand what kind of conditions we're looking at. So we have 136 trials involving those 17 towns. These were associated with 72 north-south pairs, 36 north-north, 28 south-south, and these were recoded according to the relation to the participants' own communities. So the north-south were across communities, and depending on the identity of participants, we had within one's own community or within the other community. And the measure we looked at was the proportion of signed error in the response, which could have either positive or negative values indicating overestimation or underestimation, so capturing the direction of bias in the responses. Okay, so question was, does the physical divide influence spatial estimates? Specifically, do we see overestimation of distances for the across community pairs? We did find that indeed town pair mattered. It had a significant effect on these estimates. However, we didn't replicate this border effect. We would normally expect that across communities we would find overestimation, so a positive sign here. We didn't find that. Instead, we found highest underestimation within the other communities. So participants underestimated the distances of towns in the other community, whereas, for example, in their own community, they were pretty accurate. This is close to 0. Let's see. Oh, and importantly, my note is that this was not due to their lack of knowledge of towns in the other community. So when we entered town knowledge as a covariate, that this effect still persisted. Okay, so we then looked at the results from the location estimation task. We compared the participants' placement of the towns to the actual locations using bidimensional regression analysis. We assessed specifically 2 metrics, one being the bidimensional correlation coefficient squared, which basically captures the proportion of the variance in the spatial configuration of the placement that can be explained by the actual locations of the towns. And the second metric was the scale parameter phi, which captures expansion or contraction of the placements. So what you can see, these are the kind of aggregated locations of Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, is that Cypriots contracted the locations in the other community. So you see that Greek Cypriots contracted the placement of towns in the north, these red dots, and correspondingly Turkish Cypriots contracted the locations of the southern town. So we see this interaction between community and subset of town. Now, do attitudes towards the other community moderate these effects? We had these attitude questionnaires that I mentioned that had questions about contact with the other community, feelings of warmth, perception of cultural and social distance, perceptions of symbolic and realistic threat, attitudes towards solving the Cyprus problem. And we applied dimensionality reduction using principal component analysis, coming up with these 5 factors consistent with some work by Harris Southeast. And I'll focus on this factor 1 as a predictor, which captures willingness to live together or social distance. Okay, so before we get to the results, let's kind of understand the axis a little bit. We have factor 1 here with positive values indicating being more willing to live with people from the other community, negative values less willing. And on the y-axis, we have positive values indicating overestimation and underestimation, negative values. So what we see is that those more willing to live with folks from the other community underestimated distances, whereas those less willing to live with members of the other community overestimated distances. So we have biases in different directions. Okay, so to summarize, Cypriots of both communities exhibited biases consistent with bicommunal division, with a de facto division of the island. However, we didn't find the border effect that we had expected to find. We did not find that people overestimated distances across the border. This is a little surprising. I can speculate about the reasons behind that during the Q&A if you're interested. Instead, what we found is that people underestimated and contracted distances of towns in the other community compared to their own. So this is a little bit reminiscent of the outgroup homogeneity effect, where in the social domain, people perceive members of the outgroup as being more similar in their traits to one another. Here we find it kind of in the spatial domain, perceiving distances as closer. This could also be a reference point effect, and it's not possible to distinguish these 2 possibilities here. A reference point is a geographical reference point, a landmark close to the participant that affords more discriminability of locations compared to locations farther away from the reference point. We also found that attitudes did influence spatial biases, sort of similar to carbon and letter. We found that negative attitudes or being less willing to live together was associated with distance overestimation. Here we found this across the board for all distance pairs, not just for the across boundary ones. And we also found a bias in the other direction, that being more willing to live together was associated with underestimation of distances. So to conclude, we want to raise the point that spatial representations have multifaceted origins that include social, political, and ethnic factors that are not usually associated with spatial representations. It's perhaps not surprising that the interplay of these factors varies from one geopolitical context to the other. So from Germany to Cyprus, for example. So it's important to study cognition, given the theme of this conference on cognitive diversity too, including spatial cognition too, in very geopolitical contexts. So I'd like to thank my collaborators, the funding agencies supporting this work, our research assistants from both communities, and our participants as well. And I'm happy to take your questions.